Well, 5 of the companies that received TARP money will cut cash payments to executives by 33% from last year. I sat down with Paymaster Ken Feinberg earlier today at the Treasury Department and asked him about the most significant outcome of this latest review.
The most significant outcome to me this time around in 2010 is the statistic that 85% of the top 25 individuals who were there in 2009 are still there at these companies in 2010. So in other words, the argument that I hear all the time that if you don't pay more, these individuals will leave, has turned out to be not the case.
That is significant because that was a strong argument that they made.
The strongest argument, that in order to be competitive, we have to keep our people, and we can't keep our people unless you provide them more cash and more direct compensation. The statistics show otherwise. Of the 119 people that were there in 2009 and 2010, about 85% of them, 104 or whatever it is, are still there, still collecting compensation, still working for the companies, and we think that's a very, very positive sign.
Says a lot, doesn't it?
I think it does.
All right, what caught our attention too was obviously the look back, the review that you're going to do in late October of 2008 and early 2009. Let me ask you, so these are companies you're going to be looking at: JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. What are you trying to accomplish by doing this? Under
the law passed by Congress, I'm required to do this. This is not something that I thought up. I'm implementing the law. We're trying to examine whether or not there were compensation practices at all of these companies, not just the 3 you mentioned.
Right, many.
That's right, 419 of them. Were there compensation practices engaged in that were contrary or inconsistent with the public interest? And we'll look at the size of that compensation. We'll look at the principles underlying the compensation. Was it guaranteed? Was it performance-based? How much was cash? How much was stock? We'll take a long, hard look at this and issue a report on whether or not that compensation is inconsistent.
Let me ask you something, though, Ken, because you can only recommend actions, whatever that outcome may be from that report. You can't legally necessarily force them to do anything. So I guess some folks are saying, is this just a show, a little bit of style, not a lot of substance?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've found so far in this job that the bully pulpit can have some impact. And it remains to be seen, I agree with you, it remains to be seen whether or not, absent enforcement authority, whether or not in cases perhaps where there is an inconsistent payment, we'll be able to use the force of my position in at Treasury to get some relief from these individual companies.
How far would you go? Would you single out individual contracts of individuals at firms to make your case and maybe force those companies to do the right thing, in your view?
Again, we'll have to look at the data, look at the contract, see what was done, over what period of time, how much, the size of these compensation awards. We'll just have to look at the data. I don't want to prejudge any of this. It may be that a company that has completely repaid its TARP obligation to the taxpayer can argue quite forcefully, we repaid the taxpayer with interest. We may have paid this compensation, but the result was beneficial.
Right.
We'll have to see.
Well, that's a good point, because some have said, take your JP Morgan or your Goldman Sachs, have repaid, and taxpayers have actually made money on this. So when do we leave these firms alone?
Well, under the law, we leave these firms alone when they repay their top obligation, if it's one of the 7 companies that were originally under my jurisdiction. And at the end of this look-back period, then those companies that repaid top, we then leave them alone.
In that look-back period, Ken, do you anticipate that you're going to see some outrageous pay packages, that you're going to have to talk to these firms and maybe possibly go back and get back that money?
We shall see. I'm sure we'll see some outrageous pay packages. Whether or not those pay packages are inconsistent with the public interest or can be justified or explained away, I am completely neutral on that until I look at the data.
You know, and I really pressed Feinberg. We asked him a couple more times about whether or not he expected to see those outrageous pay package from those firms, be it a Goldman, a Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, in that 4-month period between late 2008 and early 2009, that look-back period when he is ultimately done with that review. And he really kept saying he needs to wait to get that information from the firms, review that information, see what comes in, and really kind of analyze it. So he really wouldn't commit. But keep in mind, you know, it is a strong point that some of these firms, they did as you know, repay back the government with interest. So the taxpayer has made some money on that bailout money that was initially given to those firms. It's an interesting issue. We'll just have to wait, though, until that next round of review comes up from Mr. Feinberg.